Imagine a 12-year-old boy, Micah, from a struggling neighborhood, risking everything to save a millionaire's son trapped in a wreck. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Secrets, courage, and an act of kindness that shakes the community. What would you do if the world doubted your intentions? Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a future update. The dim glow of a street lamp spilled through the cracked blinds of a small apartment in Atlanta, Georgia. Micah Brooks stirred awake, his body instinctively reacting to the faint creak of his mother, Carla, moving in the kitchen. It was 5:15 a.m., a time most 12-year-olds would still be sound asleep, but not Micah. Responsibility, unspoken yet deeply felt, pulled him out of the thin blanket he shared with his younger brother Devin on their worn-out couch. The air was cool and quiet, the type of silence that wrapped their modest home in an uneasy stillness. In the kitchen, Carla stood near the stove, carefully measuring out the last spoonful of instant coffee. Her uniform, neatly pressed but faded from countless wash cycles, hung loosely on her tired frame. She paused when she heard Micah shuffle in, a mixture of surprise and concern flickering across her face. "Micah, you should still be asleep," she said softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Micah shook his head. "I couldn't let you leave without making sure Imani and Devin are ready for school." "I got this, Mama." Carla let out a weary sigh, leaning against the counter. "You're just a boy. You shouldn't have to carry all this, Micah." Micah offered a small smile. "I'm not carrying it, Mama. I'm sharing it." The simplicity of his words brought a flicker of emotion to Carla's face, but she quickly masked it. She turned to the pantry, scanning the near-empty shelves. A half loaf of bread, a can of beans, and a carton of milk sat forlornly, reminders of their daily struggles. Micah glanced at her, reading her thoughts as if they were written plainly on her face. "Don't worry, Mama. I'll make it work." Carla placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it gently. "You always do, baby, but it shouldn't be like this." Micah didn't respond. Instead, he began pulling together breakfast, slicing the bread and thinning the milk with water. Carla watched him for a moment before grabbing her worn leather bag from the counter. "I'll be back late tonight," she said, her tone serious. "You take care of Imani and Devin, and Micah." She paused, her gaze locking with his. "Never let this world make you think you're less than what you are. You hear me?" Micah nodded, a lump forming in his throat as he watched his mother leave. The door clicked shut, and the apartment seemed to exhale in her absence. Imani and Devin soon wandered into the kitchen, their sleepy eyes lighting up at the sight of breakfast on the table. Micah handed Imani the larger piece of toast, his stomach tightening at the realization he'd likely go hungry again. "Eat up, y'all. We gotta get moving," Micah urged, his voice steady despite the weight of his worries. By 7:30 a.m., Micah had walked his siblings to school, their small hands clutching his as they navigated the bustling city streets. Imani skipped ahead, humming a song she'd learned in class, while Devin clung tightly to Micah's arm. The sight of the school's brick building brought a sense of relief, knowing they'd have a hot lunch and a few hours of safety. After hugging his siblings goodbye, Micah turned to make his way home. His thoughts wandered to the eviction notice Carla had crumpled into her bag the night before. The red letters spelling "Final Warning" were etched into his mind, a haunting reminder of the fragility of their situation. As he walked past rows of weathered houses and cracked sidewalks, Micah's resolve hardened. He didn't have the luxury of being a child. Every choice he made carried the weight of his family's survival. But even in the shadow of despair, Micah held on to one unwavering truth. If he couldn't change their circumstances now, he'd find a way to one day. Micah glanced up at the rising sun, its golden light breaking through the gray sky. A sense of determination coursed through him as he clenched his fists, silently vowing that somehow he'd find a way to make things better for his family. The morning sun rose higher as Micah made his way home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The promise he had made to himself to find a way to help his family beat in his chest like a steady drum. The sidewalks were lined with uneven cracks, and cars passed lazily by, their drivers barely noticing the boy walking with his hands stuffed into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. Micah's mind churned with possibilities, but the reality of their situation weighed heavily on his shoulders. He turned onto Peachtree Avenue, the bustling street cutting through the heart of their community. Small shops lined one side of the road, their windows decorated with colorful signs advertising hot meals and discounted goods. The other side was framed by homes with peeling paint and sagging porches. Life in Atlanta's inner city moved to its own rhythm, fast-paced, unpredictable, and often unforgiving. Micah's thoughts broke as the piercing sound of screeching tires filled the air. His head snapped toward the intersection ahead, where a large black SUV swerved out of control. Time seemed to slow as the vehicle skidded wildly, its tires leaving black streaks on the asphalt. A deafening crash followed as the SUV flipped onto its roof, landing with a violent thud. Gasps echoed from bystanders frozen in place. Micah stood still, his breath caught in his throat. Smoke began to rise from the hood of the overturned vehicle, curling into the air like a warning. The muffled cry of a baby broke through the chaos. The sound sent a shiver through Micah, jolting him into action. Without thinking, he ran toward the wreck. Around him, adults hesitated, some shouting for help, others pulling out their phones to record the scene. "Someone call 911, Micah yelled, but no one moved closer. His sneakers pounded against the pavement as he closed the distance to the SUV. The acrid smell of burning oil stung his nose, and shards of glass glinted like tiny daggers on the ground. Micah dropped to his knees, peering into the shattered window. Inside, he saw the source of the cries. A baby strapped into a car seat, its tiny face red with fear. The driver, a woman, lay slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious. "Hang on, little one," Micah whispered, his voice shaking. He yanked on the car door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The metal was warped from the impact, and his fingers slipped as he pulled harder. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Help me!" he shouted again, glancing over his shoulder. Still, no one stepped forward. A man holding a phone met Micah's eyes but quickly looked away, retreating further from the wreck. Micah turned back to the car, gritting his teeth. He reached into the shattered window, ignoring the sharp edges that bit into his forearm. His hand found the seatbelt latch, fumbling against the buckle. The baby's cries grew louder, its tiny arms flailing. "Almost there," Micah muttered, his own voice trembling. "I got you. I got you." The seatbelt finally clicked loose. Micah cradled the baby against his chest, its small body trembling against him. The child's cries were muffled as he pulled back from the window, his knees crunching on broken glass. Smoke grew thicker around him, a reminder of the rising danger. A loud pop startled him, the engine sputtering as if ready to ignite. Micah didn't dare look back. He sprinted away from the wreckage, clutching the baby tightly. His breath came in ragged gasps as he crossed the street, collapsing onto the sidewalk a safe distance away. The baby's cries softened as Micah rocked it gently. Around him, onlookers murmured in hushed voices, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The sight of a young boy running into danger while adults stood frozen was not one they would soon forget. "Is the baby okay?" someone finally asked, stepping closer. Micah looked up, his arms still wrapped protectively around the child. "I think so," he said, his voice hoarse. "But the driver, someone needs to help her." The sound of sirens in the distance cut through the murmurs. Relief washed over Micah, knowing help was on the way. "You're a hero, kid," said a middle-aged woman, her voice thick with emotion. She placed a hand on Micah's shoulder, but he barely noticed. His focus was on the baby in his arms, its cries now replaced with soft whimpers. Micah stood slowly, his legs shaky but determined. His eyes drifted to the large mansion at the end of the street. It towered above the neighborhood, its iron gates glinting in the sunlight. He had seen a woman with a baby there before, walking in the garden. Maybe this baby belonged to her. Clutching the child tightly, Micah began to walk toward the estate, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. His chest burned with every breath, his hands stung from cuts and scrapes, but his resolve remained unshaken. He didn't have time to second-guess himself. All that mattered was getting the baby to safety. Micah's legs ached as he climbed the slight incline leading to the towering mansion at the end of Peachtree Avenue. The baby nestled in his arms whimpered softly, clutching the edge of the thin blanket wrapped around it. Sweat trickled down his brow, mixing with the grime and dried blood on his hands. The adrenaline that had fueled him moments earlier began to wane, replaced by a creeping exhaustion, but he pressed on. Behind him, the scene of the wreck faded into the distance, punctuated by the wail of approaching sirens. Micah didn't stop to look back. He had one goal: to get the baby to safety. The grand estate loomed closer, its iron gates standing tall and unyielding, like sentinels guarding a world far removed from his own. The mansion was unlike anything Micah had ever seen up close. Its pristine white columns and sprawling gardens seemed to belong to another reality, one where money could solve problems and sorrow stayed on the other side of the gates. Micah felt out of place, but didn't let the feeling deter him. He approached the gates, his heart pounding against his ribs, and banged on them with his fist. "Hello! Somebody please, I got a baby here!" The clang of his knock echoed in the stillness, but there was no immediate response. He banged again, his voice cracking as he called out, "I think this baby belongs to someone here. Please open up." Moments later, a man in a sharp suit emerged from the shaded pathway beyond the gates. His steps were measured, his expression cautious. Micah noticed the glint of a communication earpiece tucked in his ear. The man stopped a few feet from the gate, his piercing gaze scanning Micah from head to toe before settling on the baby in his arms. "What's going on here?" the man demanded, his tone firm but not unkind. Micah stepped closer, his voice trembling. "There was an accident. A bad one. The car flipped. I pulled the baby out. I think it's yours." The man's expression tightened as he reached for a small device in his pocket, speaking quickly into it. A moment later, the gates groaned open, and two security guards in uniform strode out to flank the man in the suit. Micah instinctively stepped back, tightening his hold on the baby. "Wait," one of the guards said, holding up a hand. "Let's see the child." Micah hesitated, his eyes darting between the guards. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, his voice breaking. I couldn't leave the baby there." A voice cut through the tense exchange, authoritative yet tinged with concern. "What's going on out here?" Micah turned to see a tall man in a tailored navy suit walking briskly toward them. His presence commanded attention, and even the guards straightened as he approached. The man's sharp features softened for a moment when his eyes landed on the baby, but they quickly hardened again when he looked at Micah. "I'm Grant Montgomery," the man announced. "That's my son." Micah opened his mouth to explain, but Grant's intense gaze pinned him in place. "Who are you?" Grant demanded. "And what are you doing with my child?" The accusation stung. Micah's grip on the baby tightened protectively, and his voice wavered as he tried to respond. I found him. The car. It crashed. I just wanted to help." Grant's suspicion was palpable, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer. The baby let out a soft cry as if sensing the tension. "Sir," one of the guards interrupted, "the boy's hands are injured. Looks like he was really in the wreck." Grant's gaze flickered to Micah's bloodied hands. For a moment, uncertainty crossed his face, but it quickly gave way to the steel resolve of a man used to guarding his own. "Come inside," Grant finally said, his tone clipped. "But I want answers, and I want them now." The guard stepped aside, allowing Micah to follow Grant through the gates. Each step into the estate felt heavier than the last. The manicured garden and immaculate pathways only heightened Micah's awareness of the dirt clinging to his shoes and the sweat on his face. As they approached the grand entrance, a woman appeared in the doorway. Her blonde hair framed a face etched with worry, and her hands flew to her mouth when she saw the baby. "Theo!" she cried, rushing forward. Micah instinctively held the baby out to her, relief washing over him as she took him into her arms. The woman, Evelyn Montgomery, cradled the baby tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes meeting Micah's with genuine gratitude. But Grant's stern voice broke the moment. "You still haven't answered my question, boy. Who were you and why were you near my son?" Micah swallowed hard, his voice barely audible as he replied, My name is Micah Brooks. I just wanted to help. Grant's eyes narrowed, his distrust unwavering despite Evelyn's soft protests. The tension in the air was thick as the guards exchanged uncertain glances. Micah stood his ground, clutching his injured hands, his resolve unshaken. He wasn't sure what awaited him inside this world of wealth and power, but he knew he had done the right thing. Micah stood frozen in the ornate foyer of the Montgomery estate, its marble floors gleaming under the soft glow of a chandelier. The baby, now safe in Evelyn's arms, had stopped crying, but the tension in the room remained thick. Grant Montgomery's piercing gaze bore into Micah, a storm of suspicion and unspoken questions brewing in his eyes. Micah shifted uncomfortably, his hands aching and blood drying on his fingers, but he didn't falter. I already told you, Micah said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. There was a crash. The car flipped. I heard the baby crying and I couldn't just leave him there. Grant crossed his arms, his sharp features unreadable. And where were the other bystanders? Why were you the one who pulled him out? Micah hesitated. The memory of the frozen crowd flashed through his mind, their phones raised, their feet rooted to the ground. No one else came forward, he admitted, his voice soft. I didn't think, I just moved. Evelyn, who had been silently cradling her son, looked up at Micah. Her tear-streaked face softened, and she placed a hand on Grant's arm. Grant, look at him, he's a child himself, she said, her tone gentle but firm. And he saved Theo's life. Grant glanced at her, his jaw tightening. Before he could respond, one of the security guards cleared his throat. Sir, you might want to see this, the guard said, holding up a phone. The room grew still as the guard played a video recorded by one of the bystanders at the accident scene. The grainy footage showed the SUV, smoke billowing from its hood, and a small figure, Micah, crawling into the wreckage. Gasps echoed faintly in the background as the video captured Micah emerging with the baby in his arms, the wreck erupting in flames moments later. Grant's face shifted as he watched, his brows furrowing. He looked back at Micah, his expression no longer cold but uncertain. You risked your life, Grant murmured, the weight of the truth sinking in. Micah nodded, his throat tightening. I couldn't just leave him there, he repeated, his voice barely audible. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a hand on Micah's shoulder. You're a brave young man, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. Grant remained silent, his eyes fixed on Micah. The guards exchanged glances, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Finally, Grant spoke, his voice softer but still measured. Why don't we get those hands looked at? Micah hesitated, unsure if this was an invitation or a command. Evelyn gently guided him to a nearby chair, instructing one of the staff members to bring a first aid kit. As they cleaned the cuts on his hands, Micah felt the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him. Grant leaned against the wall, watching Micah with a thoughtful expression. Where do you live, Micah? He asked, his tone less harsh. Micah glanced up, wary. Not far from here, just down on Vine Street. Grant's brow furrowed. That's not an easy place to grow up. Micah shrugged, his voice steady. It's home. My family's there. Evelyn exchanged a look with Grant, her eyes softening. Micah, she said gently, do your parents know where you are? My mom's at work, Micah replied. She doesn't know yet. Evelyn's expression shifted to concern, but Grant spoke before she could respond. We'll make sure you get home safely, he said, his tone firm. But before you go, I want to understand something. Micah met his gaze, his posture straightening. What? Grant hesitated, his voice lowering. Why did you do it? Running into a burning car? Risking your life for someone you don't know? The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Micah thought for a moment, his fingers twisting the edge of his shirt. My mom always says, if you see someone in trouble, you help them. It's what makes us human. I couldn't stand there and do nothing. Grant's expression softened further, his defenses crumbling. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. That's something not many people understand, he said quietly. The room fell into a contemplative silence. The tension that had once filled the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by something else, a quiet understanding. As the staff finished bandaging Micah's hands, Evelyn smiled at him, her gratitude palpable. Thank you, Micah. You saved my son. You saved our family. Micah offered a small smile in return, though his thoughts were already drifting back to his own family and the challenges that awaited him. He had done the right thing, but the weight of their struggles still loomed large in his mind. The weight of Micah's words lingered in the air long after he left the Montgomery estate that day. Grant Montgomery stood in the quiet of the foyer, his mind replaying the boy's resolute expression and the quiet determination in his voice. Despite his initial suspicion, Grant couldn't shake the image of Micah, a boy risking everything for a child he didn't know, only to ask for nothing in return. Evelyn watched her husband carefully as he sat in the study later that evening. The glow of the fireplace cast shadows on Grant's face, his expression pensive. "You're still thinking about him, aren't you?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft. Grant nodded slowly. "That boy, he did more than save Theo's life. He showed a kind of bravery I don't see every day." He paused, staring into the flames. "I need to find a way to repay him." The next afternoon, Micah returned home from school to find Carla standing in the kitchen, holding a neatly folded envelope. Her brow was furrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Micah, some man came by earlier asking about you," she said, her tone uneasy. Micah's heart skipped a beat. "What man?" he asked quickly. "He said his name was Grant Montgomery," Carla replied. "He left this." She handed Micah the envelope, her expression curious but guarded. "Micah, what's going on?" Micah opened the envelope carefully, revealing an elegantly written note. It read, "Micah, your actions the other day were nothing short of heroic. My wife and I would like to invite you and your family to dinner at our home tomorrow evening. Please join us. We'd like to thank you properly. Sincerely, Grant Montgomery." Micah's throat tightened. He looked up at Carla, her eyes searching his face. "It's about the baby," he said quietly. "There was an accident, and I helped." Carla's expression softened with a mixture of pride and concern. "You did a good thing, Micah. But why does this man want to see us now?" "I think he just wants to say thank you," Micah replied, though doubt lingered in his mind. The next evening, the Brooks family approached the grand gates of the Montgomery estate. Carla wore her best blouse, though it was slightly worn at the cuffs. Imani and Devon clutched Micah's hands, their wide eyes taking in the sprawling gardens and the stately mansion. Micah felt a pang of self-consciousness as they stepped inside, their humble appearance stark against the opulence surrounding them. Grant and Evelyn greeted them warmly at the door. Evelyn knelt to Imani and Devon's height, offering them gentle smiles and small candies. "You must be Micah's little brother and sister," she said warmly. "It's so nice to meet you." Carla held herself with quiet dignity, her voice polite but reserved. "Thank you for inviting us, Mr. Montgomery. We appreciate your kindness." "Please call me Grant," he replied, gesturing for them to follow him into the dining room. The table was set with silverware that gleamed under the light of an elaborate chandelier. A savory aroma filled the air, and Devon's stomach growled audibly, making Imani stifle a giggle. As they ate, the conversation turned to Micah's actions. Evelyn recounted how the doctors said Theo had miraculously avoided injury, thanks to Micah's quick thinking. Grant leaned forward, his gaze intent. "Micah, why didn't you tell anyone what you'd done?" he asked. Micah hesitated, glancing at Carla. "It didn't feel like something to talk about," he said simply. "I just did what I had to do." Grant exchanged a look with Evelyn, admiration flickering in his eyes. "You've got a good head on your shoulders, Micah," he said, "and a good heart." The dinner concluded with Evelyn serving dessert, but as the plates were cleared, Grant leaned forward again, his tone turning serious. "Micah," he began, "I'd like to offer your family some help. I know times are tough and I want to do something to ease that burden." Carla's shoulders stiffened. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her tone firm, "we don't take handouts." Grant raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I understand that, Mrs. Brooks. But what if it wasn't a handout? What if it was an opportunity?" He turned back to Micah, his gaze steady. "How would you like to work here at the estate? We could use someone dependable like you, and it'd be honest work." Micah blinked, surprised. The offer caught him off guard, but he didn't need time to think. "I'd like that, sir," he said, his voice steady. Thank you. Grant smiled. Good. We'll start you after school. George, our gardener, will show you the ropes. As they left the estate that evening, Carla rested a hand on Micah's shoulder. You've made me proud, Micah, she said quietly. Just remember where you come from, and don't let anyone make you feel small. Micah nodded, his chest swelling with both determination and gratitude. He didn't know where this new path would lead, but he was ready to take the first step. Micah woke the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The memory of the Montgomery mansion, with its gleaming chandeliers and warm smiles, felt almost dreamlike. Yet the handshake from Grant Montgomery, the promise of honest work, was as real as the ache of his worn sneakers. His mother's parting words echoed in his mind as he tied his shoes. Remember where you come from. After school, Micah made his way back to the estate, the anticipation building with every step. By the time he reached the gates, the guard gave him a nod, waving him through without hesitation. It felt strange to be acknowledged in a place so far removed from his own world. In the sprawling back garden, George, the head gardener, stood waiting. He was a wiry man in his 60s with weathered hands and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. So, you're the new recruit, George said, extending a hand. Welcome to the garden, Micah. Micah shook his hand, his grip firm. Thank you, sir. I'll do my best. George chuckled. Call me George, and don't worry. We're not looking for perfection, just someone who's willing to learn. Micah followed George into the garden, marveling at the rows of carefully tended flowers, the towering hedges, and the distant sound of a fountain. It was a world so meticulous and vibrant, a stark contrast to the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts of Vine Street. George handed Micah a pair of gloves and clippers. First lesson, trimming the hedges. Looks easy, doesn't it? Micah nodded, but George's knowing grin told him it wouldn't be. He demonstrated the technique, his movements precise and deliberate. Micah imitated him, quickly realizing how challenging it was to keep the edges straight and even. Slow down, George said, placing a guiding hand on Micah's wrist. It's not about speed, it's about care. These plants didn't grow overnight, and they won't thrive if we rush them. Micah nodded, focusing on the task. As he worked, George began to talk, his voice steady and unhurried. You know, a garden teaches you patience, George said. Every plant here started as a seed, small, fragile. You can't rush them, no matter how much you want to see them bloom. Micah glanced up, catching the deeper meaning in George's words. Kinda like people, huh? He said softly. George smiled. Exactly. And some seeds, well, they grow in the toughest soil, but they grow all the same. The hours passed quickly as Micah moved from one task to another under George's watchful eye. He pulled weeds, carried heavy bags of mulch, and learned the names of flowers he'd never heard of before. Each job was harder than it looked, but Micah took pride in his work, his hands moving with purpose. Good work today, George said as the sun dipped low in the sky. You've got a sharp mind, Micah. Keep at it, and you'll do just fine here. Micah wiped the sweat from his brow, his arms aching but his heart full. Thanks, George. I'll see you tomorrow. As Micah walked home, the scent of the garden clung to him, mingling with the familiar smells of his neighborhood. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was building something, not just for himself, but for his family. At dinner that night, Carla listened intently as Micah described his first day. Imani's eyes lit up at the mention of roses, and even Devon smiled when Micah talked about the fountain. Carla rested a hand on his shoulder. I'm proud of you, Micah, she said, her voice filled with warmth. The next few weeks followed a steady rhythm. Each afternoon, Micah worked in the garden, his confidence growing with every task. George became a mentor, teaching him not just about plants, but about life. One day, as they pruned a particularly unruly hedge, George said, You've got something most people don't, Micah, a willingness to get your hands dirty for the right reasons. Micah shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. I just want to help my family. And that's exactly why you'll go far, George replied, his tone serious. Never lose sight of what matters. As the sun began to set that evening, Grant appeared in the garden, his polished shoes in odd contrast to the dirt paths. He watched Micah for a moment before approaching. Micah, Grant said, his voice measured. I've been watching your work. George tells me you're a quick learner. Micah straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. I'm just trying to do my best, sir. Grant nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'd like to talk to you about something. Come to my office tomorrow after your shift. Micah's heart raced, but he kept his face steady. Yes, sir, I'll be there. As Grant walked away, George clapped a hand on Micah's shoulder. Sounds like he sees what I see in you, kid. Micah didn't respond, but the quiet pride in his chest was unmistakable. He had started as a stranger at the gates, but now he was carving out a place for himself in this new world. Micah's hands were still stained with soil when he walked back into his neighborhood that evening. The sense of pride he carried from the Montgomery estate felt fragile as the familiar sounds of the streets met his ears. The hum of distant car engines, shouted conversations, and the occasional sharp laugh echoed down Vine Street. It was a stark contrast to the calm, manicured gardens he had just left behind. As he approached the apartment, a chill ran through him. Something felt off. The usual group of neighbors chatting on their porches was smaller tonight, their voices hushed. Mrs. Green, who always waved as he passed, avoided his eyes, hurrying inside with a worried glance. Micah climbed the steps to his door, the hinges creaking as he pushed it open. Carla was at the table, her head bowed over a stack of papers. Bills. Her face was tense, her shoulders stiff. Hey, Ma, Micah greeted softly, setting his bag on the floor. Carla looked up, her eyes tired but warm. Hey, baby. How was work? It was good. George is teaching me a lot, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Carla nodded, but her gaze flickered toward the window, her unease clear. I'm glad you're learning, Micah, but you be careful around here, okay? Things are tense. Micah frowned, pulling out a chair to sit across from her. What do you mean? Carla hesitated, then sighed. There've been some break-ins on the block. People are scared. I don't want you out too late. Micah's chest tightened. The fragile stability they clung to always felt threatened, but this was different. It was a reminder of how easily their world could unravel. The next morning, Micah woke early to take Imani and Devon to school. As they walked, he noticed more boarded-up windows, more locks on doors. The tension Carla spoke of was palpable. Micah, why are people scared? Imani asked, her small hand gripping his tightly. Micah glanced down at her, searching for the right words. Sometimes people forget how to be kind, he said gently. But don't worry. I won't let anything happen to us. At school, Imani hugged him tightly before running inside with Devon. Micah lingered at the gate, watching until they disappeared into the building. The weight of responsibility settled heavier on his shoulders as he turned to head toward the estate. Later that afternoon, as Micah worked in the Montgomery garden, George noticed his distraction. What's on your mind, kid? Micah hesitated, then sighed. Things are tough back home. People are scared. I don't know how to make it better. George nodded thoughtfully, leaning on his rake. Sometimes life throws shadows over everything, but you've got to remember, shadows only mean there's light somewhere close by. The words resonated with Micah, though he wasn't sure why. He nodded, focusing on the task at hand, but the unease from earlier lingered in the back of his mind. When the day ended, Micah began his walk home, his path illuminated by the fading glow of the setting sun. As he rounded the corner onto Vine Street, he noticed a figure leaning against a lamppost. The man was tall, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. Micah Brooks, right? The man called out, his voice low and smooth. Micah froze, his instincts immediately on edge. Who's asking? The man chuckled, stepping closer. Just someone who's heard about you. A boy from Vine Street working for the Montgomerys. That's quite a story. Micah's fists clenched, his heart pounding. What do you want? The man tilted his head, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Nothing. Yet. Just remember, kid, not everyone's happy seeing someone like you cross over into their world. Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Micah standing there, his chest tight with unease. When he got home, Carla noticed his pale face immediately. Micah, what happened? Nothing, Ma, he said quickly, forcing a smile. Just a long day. But as he lay in bed that night, Micah couldn't shake the man's words, or the feeling that trouble was brewing, closer than he wanted to believe. The shadows of Vine Street weighed heavily on Micah's mind as the days passed. He went about his routine, school in the morning, work at the Montgomery estate in the afternoon. But the man's cryptic words lingered, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. Still, he pushed forward, focused on his responsibilities, and determined to keep his family safe. One afternoon, as Micah was tending to the roses with George, Evelyn appeared in the garden, her usual warm smile lighting up her face. She carried a clipboard and a neatly folded stack of invitations. "Micah," she began, her tone kind, "I have a favor to ask." Micah straightened, brushing dirt from his gloves. "Of course, Mrs. Montgomery. What do you need?" "We're hosting our annual summer gala this weekend," she explained. "It's a big event, and I'd like you to help George and the staff prepare the garden. It's the centerpiece of the party." Micah hesitated, glancing at George, who gave him a reassuring nod. "I can do that," Micah said finally. Evelyn's smile widened. "Thank you, Micah. And one more thing. We'd like you to attend the gala as our guest." Micah blinked, stunned. "Me?" "Yes," Evelyn said firmly. "After everything you've done for our family, it's only right." George clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll do fine, kid. Just don't let the fancy clothes intimidate you." That evening, Micah told Carla about the invitation. Her eyes widened, a mixture of pride and concern flickering across her face. "That's a big honor, Micah," she said. "But are you sure you're ready for something like this?" "I don't know," Micah admitted. "But I want to try. Maybe it's a chance to show them who we really are." Carla nodded, her expression softening. "Then we'll make sure you're ready." The days leading up to the gala were a whirlwind of activity. Micah worked tirelessly alongside George and the other staff, trimming hedges, arranging flowers, and ensuring every detail of the garden was perfect. Despite the back-breaking labor, Micah felt a sense of pride in their work. When the evening of the gala arrived, the Montgomery estate was transformed. Strings of twinkling lights hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the garden. Tables draped in fine linens were set with elegant place settings, and a live band played soft jazz near the fountain. Guests in glittering gowns and tailored suits began to arrive, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Micah stood near the edge of the garden, dressed in a simple suit loaned to him by one of the staff. He felt out of place among the opulence, but he straightened his shoulders and took a deep breath. Evelyn spotted him and made her way over, her face lighting up with approval. "You clean up nicely, Micah," she said warmly. "Thank you," he replied, his voice quiet but steady. Grant joined them moments later, a glass of champagne in hand. "Micah," he said, his tone firm but not unkind, "enjoy yourself tonight. You've earned it." Micah nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on him. He caught snippets of whispers from nearby guests. "Is that the boy who saved their baby? What's he doing here?" Despite the murmurs, Micah kept his head high. He wandered through the garden, admiring the fruits of his labor and marveling at how different the estate looked under the glow of the lights. As the evening progressed, Grant called for everyone's attention. He stood at the base of the fountain, Evelyn and Theo by his side. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant began, his voice commanding, "thank you all for joining us tonight. This year's gala is particularly special to my family, as we've been reminded of the incredible strength of our community." He gestured toward Micah, who froze as every head turned in his direction. "I'd like to introduce you to Micah Brooks," Grant continued, "a young man who showed extraordinary courage and selflessness when he saved our son's life." Applause erupted, and Micah felt his face flush. He stepped forward reluctantly, his heart pounding in his chest. Grant extended a hand, pulling Micah closer. "Micah, you've reminded us all of the power of kindness and bravery. On behalf of my family, thank you." Evelyn handed Micah a small box, her eyes shining with gratitude. Inside was a sleek watch engraved with the words, "To Micah Brooks, a hero among us." The crowd's applause grew louder, but as Micah glanced around, he noticed a figure lurking near the garden's edge. It was the man from Vine Street, the one who had spoken to him in the shadows. Micah's stomach twisted. He tried to focus on the moment, but the man's presence sent a ripple of unease through him. Why was he here? As the gala continued, Micah couldn't shake the feeling that the man was watching him. Every laugh, every clink of glasses felt distant as Micah's mind raced. He had stepped into a world so different from his own, but now it seemed that the shadows of his neighborhood had followed him. The applause still echoed in Micah's ears as he stepped away from the fountain, the engraved watch heavy in his hand. The glow of the evening, the kind smiles from the Montgomerys, and the sparkling lights in the garden should have filled him with pride. But his eyes kept darting toward the edge of the garden, where the shadowy figure loomed. The man from Vine Street, his posture casual but his intent unmistakable, was watching. Micah's grip tightened around the box. He couldn't let fear show. Not here, not now. With a deep breath, he rejoined the crowd, nodding politely as guests congratulated him. Evelyn approached, her warm smile easing some of his tension. "Micah," she said, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. "How are you holding up? All of this must be overwhelming." "I'm okay," Micah replied, forcing a small smile. "It's just a lot." She nodded knowingly. "You've earned every bit of it. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Micah appreciated her words, but his attention was drawn back to the edge of the garden. The man had disappeared. A chill ran down his spine. He excused himself politely and began weaving through the crowd, searching for George. The older man had always seemed to have answers, and Micah needed one now. He found George near the hedge maze, directing a staff member on where to set up additional lights. "George," Micah said urgently, his voice low. "Can I talk to you?" George turned, his brow furrowing at the worry etched across Micah's face. "What's wrong, kid?" "There was a man," Micah began, glancing over his shoulder. "At the edge of the garden. He's been following me. He showed up on Vine Street, and now he's here." George's eyes narrowed, his usual calm demeanor replaced by concern. "Did he say anything to you?" Micah hesitated, then nodded. "He said people don't like seeing someone like me cross over." "I don't know what he means, but it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a threat." George's jaw tightened. "Stay close to me. Let's find Mr. Montgomery." The two made their way through the garden, Micah's nerves on edge with every step. When they reached Grant, he was deep in conversation with a group of distinguished guests. But the moment George placed a firm hand on his shoulder, he turned. "Grant," George said in a tone that brooked no argument, "we need a word. Privately." Grant's brows knitted as he excused himself, following them to a quieter corner of the garden. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone serious. Micah explained quickly, his words spilling out in a rush. Grant's face darkened as he listened, his sharp mind processing every detail. When Micah finished, Grant placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're safe here, Micah," he said firmly. "No one will harm you on my property." Micah nodded, but the knot in his chest didn't loosen. "What if he's right, though? What if people are angry because I don't belong here?" Grant knelt slightly to meet Micah's gaze, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. "Micah, you've earned your place here through your actions, not privilege. That's more than most people can say. Don't let anyone take that from you." Evelyn joined them moments later, her eyes widening when she caught the tension in their expressions. Grant explained briefly and she reached for Micah's hand. "You're part of this family now," she said softly. "We won't let anything happen to you." As the gala continued, Grant instructed the guards to keep a close watch. Micah tried to shake the unease, focusing instead on mingling with the guests and absorbing the unfamiliar world around him, but the shadow of the man's words lingered. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Grant pulled Micah aside. "I made a few calls," he said quietly. "The man you described has a history. He's connected to some unsavory individuals in your neighborhood. I think he's trying to intimidate you." Micah's fists clenched. "Why? I haven't done anything to him." "Sometimes," Grant said carefully, "when people see someone rise above their circumstances, it challenges their perception of what's possible. It makes them uncomfortable." Micah swallowed hard, the truth of Grant's words sinking in. He had worked so hard to prove himself, but he hadn't realized how much that effort might unsettle others. As the evening drew to a close, Micah helped the staff clean up, his movements slower than usual as his mind raced. Before he left, George pulled him aside. Listen, kid, George said, his voice firm. You've got a lot of people rooting for you, but you've also got to stay sharp. If that man shows up again, you let me or Grant know immediately. Understand? Micah nodded, his resolve hardening. I will. Walking home that night, the streets of Vine Street felt darker than usual. The man was nowhere to be seen, but Micah's instincts remained on high alert. As he approached the apartment, he spotted Carla waiting on the porch, her arms crossed and her face lined with worry. Micah, she said softly, pulling him into a hug. I heard about the gala. You're doing amazing things. Don't let anything or anyone dim that. Micah nodded, her words settling into his heart like a shield. No matter the shadows, he wouldn't let fear dictate his path. The night weighed heavy on Micah's thoughts as he lay awake in his small room. Carla's words from the porch had given him strength, but the shadows of Vine Street and the stranger's cryptic message lingered in his mind. As he closed his eyes, he replayed Grant Montgomery's reassurance. You've earned your place here. Yet a question gnawed at him. Why did it feel like earning his place came with so much resistance? The following day, Micah arrived at the Montgomery estate earlier than usual. The garden was still cloaked in the soft light of dawn, the dew on the leaves glistening like tiny jewels. George was nowhere to be found yet, so Micah took the opportunity to get a head start on the flower beds, his hands moving with practiced precision. Micah, a familiar voice called from behind him. He turned to see Grant approaching, his usual commanding presence tempered by something quieter, more introspective. He wasn't dressed in his typical tailored suit. Instead, he wore casual slacks and a button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up. Good morning, sir, Micah greeted, brushing dirt off his gloves. Grant nodded, gesturing toward a stone bench near the fountain. Join me for a moment. There's something I want to share with you. Micah hesitated but followed, his curiosity piqued. He sat across from Grant, who leaned forward, clasping his hands together. For a long moment he didn't speak, his gaze fixed on the rippling water of the fountain. Do you know why I'm so protective of Theo? Grant asked finally, his voice low. Micah shook his head. Because he's your son? Grant smiled faintly but shook his head. It's more than that. When I was your age, I wasn't living in a place like this. I didn't grow up in wealth or privilege. My father worked 3 jobs, and my mother cleaned houses for families who never bothered to learn her name. Micah blinked, surprised. He had assumed Grant had always been a man of means, his life untouched by struggle. Every night, Grant continued, I'd watch my parents come home exhausted, their hands calloused, their faces lined with worry. They gave everything they had to give me a chance, a better life, and when I finally made something of myself, I promised I'd never take it for granted. He paused, his eyes meeting Micah's. That's why I understand you, why I see myself in you. You remind me of what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. Micah's throat tightened. I'm just trying to help my family, he said softly. And you're doing more than that, Grant replied. But I need you to understand something. When you stand out, when you rise above expectations, people notice, and not all of them will cheer for you. Some will try to pull you back down. The stranger's face flashed in Micah's mind, and his fists clenched involuntarily. I've noticed, he admitted. Grant leaned forward, his gaze steady. The world isn't always fair, Micah, but you don't let that stop you. You keep moving forward no matter who tries to hold you back. Micah nodded, the weight of Grant's words sinking in. I'll try, he said, his voice firmer now. Grant placed a hand on his shoulder. You're already doing it, and you're not alone in this. Remember that. As they sat in silence, the sun began to rise higher, casting warm light over the garden. George appeared in the distance, waving to Micah, but he didn't interrupt. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery, Micah said finally, for everything. Grant smiled, standing. Just call me Grant, and don't be late for your shift. Micah chuckled softly, the tension in his chest easing. As Grant walked away, Micah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead might be steep, but for the first time he felt like he had allies to climb it with. Micah left the Montgomery estate that evening with a new perspective. Grant's story had filled him with a sense of connection, but it also underscored the challenges that lay ahead. He understood now that his journey wasn't just about helping his family. It was about standing tall in the face of adversity. Yet, as he approached Vine Street, the familiar unease crept back in. The neighborhood was alive with its usual mix of noise and activity, but there was an underlying tension that felt heavier than before. Groups of people stood clustered on corners, their conversations hushed but heated. As Micah neared his apartment, he noticed Mrs. Green, his elderly neighbor, standing on her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Micah," she called softly, beckoning him closer. "You got a minute?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, stepping up onto her porch. Her face was lined with concern, her usually warm eyes clouded. "There's been more talk about that man," she began, lowering her voice. "The one who's been asking about you. People are saying he's got connections, dangerous ones." Micah's stomach dropped, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What kind of connections?" Mrs. Green hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "Gangs, Micah. People who don't like seeing one of their own stepping out of line." Micah's hands clenched into fists. He thanked Mrs. Green and headed home, his mind racing. Once inside, he found Carla sitting at the kitchen table, her face tense as she sorted through a pile of overdue bills. Imani and Devin were on the floor, drawing pictures with crayons that had long since lost their wrappers. "Ma," Micah said, pulling her aside, "we need to talk." He explained what Mrs. Green had said, and Carla's expression darkened. "Micah," she said firmly, "you've got to be careful. These people, they don't play fair." "I know," he replied, his voice steady, "but I'm not going to let them scare me. I've worked too hard to stop now." Carla placed a hand on his cheek, her eyes softening. "I'm proud of you, baby. But promise me you'll be smart about this. We can't afford to lose you." The next day, Micah decided to address the growing tension head-on. After his shift at the Montgomery estate, he stopped by a community meeting at the local recreation center. The room was packed with neighbors, their faces a mix of fear and determination. The recent break-ins and the growing presence of gang activity had everyone on edge. Micah stood in the back, listening as people voiced their concerns. "We need more police patrols," one man said, his voice tinged with frustration. "They don't care about this neighborhood," a woman countered. "We have to take care of ourselves." As the room grew louder, Micah raised his hand, his heart pounding. "Can I say something?" he asked, his voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Micah swallowed hard but stood his ground. "I know things feel hopeless right now, but we can't let fear control us. We have to look out for each other, stand together." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others remained skeptical. "And what are you going to do, kid?" someone called out. Micah's jaw tightened. "I'm already doing something. I'm working to build a better future, not just for me, but for my family, for all of us. But I can't do it alone." Mrs. Green stood up, her voice firm. "The boy's right. We've let them push us around for too long. It's time we take our streets back." One by one, others began to chime in, their voices rising in agreement. The energy in the room shifted from despair to determination. By the end of the meeting, plans were in motion: a neighborhood watch, coordinated efforts to support families in need, and a renewed sense of unity. As Micah walked home that night, he felt a small spark of hope flicker to life. The community wasn't perfect, but it was stronger than it seemed. And maybe, just maybe, he could help make it better. The energy from the community meeting lingered in Micah's chest like a quiet flame, warming him against the growing chill of Vine Street's struggles. For the first time in weeks, he felt the neighborhood had found its voice. But as he sat at the kitchen table later that evening, helping Imani with her homework while Devin dozed on the couch, doubt began to creep back in. Change felt so distant, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. A soft knock on the door startled him from his thoughts. Carla, busy in the kitchen, motioned for Micah to answer. He approached the door cautiously, his mind flashing to the warnings about the stranger who had been watching him. Peering through the peephole, he saw a figure dressed in a postal worker's uniform holding a small envelope. Micah opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" "Delivery for Micah Brooks," the man said, handing over the envelope before retreating down the steps. Micah's name was scrawled neatly across the front in unfamiliar handwriting. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open, revealing a single sheet of paper folded carefully inside. As he unfolded it, his eyes scanned the words, and his breath caught in his throat. It was a letter from Grant Montgomery. Micah, you've shown remarkable courage, not just in saving Theo, but in the way you carry yourself every day. I see it in the work you do, in the way you stand tall despite the weight of your responsibilities. Your determination reminds me of where I came from, and I want to help you reach the heights you're capable of. Enclosed is something I hope will ease the path ahead. A scholarship fund in your name to ensure you have the education and opportunities you deserve. This is not charity. This is an investment in a future I believe in. Your strength inspires more than you know. Keep being the light that others follow. Sincerely, Grant Montgomery. Micah stared at the letter, his heart pounding. A scholarship? His mind reeled with the possibilities. College, opportunities he had barely dared to dream of. He turned the envelope over and found another slip of paper, an official document outlining the scholarship and its terms. It was real. Micah? Carla's voice brought him back to the moment. What is it, baby? Wordlessly, Micah handed her the letter. He watched as her eyes moved over the words, widening with each line. When she looked up, tears shimmered in her eyes. Micah, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Do you understand what this means? I think so, he said quietly, his own voice trembling. Carla pulled him into a tight embrace. You've earned this, every bit of it. I'm so proud of you. Micah swallowed hard, the weight of the moment settling in. It wasn't just a letter. It was a lifeline, a chance to not only help his family, but to break free from the cycle that had held Vine Street in its grip for so long. The next day, Micah brought the letter to the Montgomery estate, clutching it tightly in his hand as he approached Grant in the garden. Mr. Montgomery, Micah began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't know how to thank you for this. Grant looked up from pruning a rose bush, his expression softening. You already have, Micah. Every day with the way you live your life. Micah hesitated. I'll make the most of it, I promise. Grant smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. I know you will. That's why I gave it to you. You've earned this, Micah. Don't ever forget that. As Micah returned to the garden to continue his work, a new sense of hope blossomed within him. The scholarship wasn't just a gift. It was proof that his efforts mattered, that his dreams weren't out of reach. For the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. Micah carried the scholarship letter with him like a shield, its words an anchor in the sea of uncertainty surrounding him. The weight of Vine Street's struggles and the lingering shadow of the man who had threatened him still loomed, but for the first time, Micah felt like he had a tangible weapon in his fight to build a better future, not just for himself, but for everyone around him. The next week at the Montgomery estate, Grant asked Micah to meet him in the back garden. The air was crisp and the late summer sun cast long shadows over the immaculate hedges. Micah found Grant standing beside a sapling, its thin trunk supported by a wooden stake. George was there too, leaning on his shovel with a faint smile. Micah, Grant began, gesturing toward the sapling. Do you know what this is? Micah tilted his head, studying the tree. A magnolia? Grant nodded. Exactly. It's a symbol of resilience and endurance. Magnolias can weather storms, survive harsh conditions, and still bloom beautifully. Micah glanced between Grant and the tree, sensing a deeper meaning behind the moment. It's a strong tree, he said quietly. It is, Grant agreed. And I think it represents you. Micah blinked, taken aback. Me? Grant smiled. This tree's like you, Micah. It's planted in unfamiliar soil, but with care, it will grow and thrive. I wanted you to plant it here, in the Montgomery garden, as a reminder of everything you've overcome and everything you're capable of. Micah's throat tightened. The gesture was small yet profound. He nodded, gripping the handle of the nearby spade. As he worked to dig the hole for the sapling, George offered guidance, his tone light but encouraging. You're doing good, kid, George said. This tree's going to outlive us all, just like your impact. Micah smiled faintly, focusing on the earth beneath his hands. When the hole was ready, he carefully placed the sapling inside, steadying its delicate trunk as George filled the soil around its base. Grant handed him a small watering can, and Micah poured the cool water over the roots, watching it soak into the ground. "It's done," Micah said, stepping back to admire the tree. It was small now, fragile looking, but he could already imagine it years from now, its branches strong, its flowers in full bloom. Grant placed a hand on Micah's shoulder. "Every time you see this tree, I want you to remember that growth takes time, but it's always worth it. Just like this garden, just like you." Micah nodded, the weight of the moment settling deep in his chest. The tree wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise, a testament to everything he had endured and everything he hoped to achieve. Later that evening, as Micah walked home, he passed the recreation center where the community had held its meeting. A group of kids played basketball in the fading light, their laughter echoing through the streets. Nearby, Mrs. Green stood with a few neighbors, organizing a neighborhood watch patrol. For the first time in weeks, Vine Street felt alive again, not with fear, but with hope. When Micah reached his apartment, he found Carla waiting on the porch, her face soft with pride. She hugged him tightly, whispering, "You're building something beautiful, Micah. Don't stop." That night, as he lay in bed, Micah thought about the magnolia tree, its roots settling into the Montgomery garden. It wasn't just his story anymore. It was a symbol of everything he wanted for his family, his neighborhood, and himself. Growth, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future.